One cold New Mexico evening, a reclusive rancher heard a cry on the wind, and in a single moment, his quiet life collided with a young mother's desperate flight from a man who claimed to own her. What began as an act of mercy would lead to a standoff on his porch, a battle in court, and a choice that could cost them everything, or give them the family they never knew they were searching for. The desert holds its breath in the moments before sundown. It is not a silence you can trust. It is the sort that makes your ears strain for what you hope you won't hear. Daniel Hayes knew this quiet well. He had lived under its weight for 20 years on this patch of land outside Santa Fe, where the Rio Grande bends through the sage and cottonwoods, and the sky feels close enough to touch. He was halfway through mending a fence post, pliers warm in his calloused hand, when the sound came. At first, he thought it was the wind snagging on the wire. Then it came again, sharp, high, and torn in the middle, like it had been ripped out of a throat too dry to scream. He froze, the kind of stillness a man learns after decades of watching cattle, coyotes, and storms. This wasn't a coyote. This wasn't anything wild, except in the way a wounded thing is wild. It came from the river. He let the pliers fall to the dirt and swung over the fence with a speed his knee didn't thank him for. The air smelled of dust and the faint, coppery tang of rain that never seemed to come. The sound drifted to him again, weaker now. He crossed the pasture in long strides, boots kicking up the day's heat from the earth. When he reached the bank, he saw her. She was lying in the reeds, half slumped against a slope of mud, the kind the river leaves when it swells and retreats. Her feet were bare and raw, the skin split and blackened in places. She clutched a bundle so tight to her chest it seemed part of her. The bundle moved. Daniel stepped closer, the brim of his hat shadowing his eyes. "Ma'am." His voice came out softer than he'd expected. Her head lifted just enough for him to see her face young, but thinned by hunger and sun, hair dark and tangled with grit. Her eyes locked on his, wide and unblinking, but with no recognition. He saw fear there, yes, but also the steady watchfulness of someone who had been hunted long enough to expect nothing else. He crouched until he was level with her. "I'm not here to hurt you," he said. "Let me see the child." The word child did something. Her grip shifted, though not much. Daniel reached out slow, careful like he would with a skittish colt, and brushed the edge of the blanket. The baby's face was flushed, lips dry, a weak sound slipping past them like a dying ember of a cry. He pressed 2 fingers to the tiny neck. There it was, a heartbeat, thin but stubborn. He'd felt weaker pulses in calves that still grew to stand. Without asking more, he slid his arms under both mother and child, surprised at how little weight they carried. As he lifted her, her right hand pressed hard into his arm. He looked down and saw it carved from some dark wood, a hawk mid-flight, worn smooth where fingers had gripped it again and again. She didn't let go, not even to shift her weight. Dustfire, his Palomino mare, waited tied to a cottonwood not far upstream. Daniel mounted with them both before him. His arm braced to keep them steady. The ride back was slow. The land here could turn a stumble into a broken neck if you pushed too hard. The mare's ears flicked back at every gust, but she stepped careful. The wind was rising, and Daniel knew enough to read its temper. The ranch came into sight at last, low-roofed and dark against the pale sweep of the hills. Built from thick logs long before his time, it had outlasted 3 droughts, 2 floods, and 1 war. The porch creaked under the weight of their arrival. Inside, the air held the faint scent of cedar and wood smoke. He set her down on the couch near the hearth, the springs groaning under her slight frame. He stoked the fire until it took, brightening the room with its flicker. From the cedar chest at the foot of his bed, he pulled a heavy wool blanket and wrapped it around her shoulders. "You able to eat?" Her eyes flicked toward the hearth, then back to him. A small nod. He went to the stove, ladled beans from the pot, and set a slice of cornbread beside them on a tin plate. She took it in both hands, steadying herself before lifting the first bite. She chewed slow, as if each swallow was a risk. The baby whimpered again, and she shifted the bundle. murmuring something Daniel didn't recognize in a language he couldn't place. He looked at her, waiting for her to speak in words he understood. When she did, it was with the same quiet weight as the scream that had brought him to her. "Lena." He nodded once. "Daniel Hayes." They said nothing more. Outside, the coyotes had begun their song, threading the night air with calls that rose and fell like questions without answers. The wind rattled the shutters, and somewhere beyond the hills, lightning flashed but did not speak. Inside, the fire's glow pressed back the darkness. Daniel sat in his old rocker across from her, boots planted, hands on his knees. He watched the flames dance, their light touching the wooden hawk still clutched in her fist. He had no idea yet what road that hawk had traveled to find its way here, but he knew enough to recognize when the land had delivered something fragile to his care, and in that moment, he decided he wasn't going to let the land take it back. Morning in the desert has a way of arriving quietly, without fanfare. The sun slips over the horizon like someone easing open a door to a room where others are still asleep. Daniel Hayes had been awake for hours. Old habits from ranch life kept him rising before the light. He'd already stoked the fire and fed the chickens before Lena stepped out from the small side room. Ori tucked against her shoulder. She moved slow, not from weakness now, but from a kind of watchfulness, as if every creak of the floorboards might bring something she wasn't ready to face. They had settled into a rhythm, though neither would have called it that aloud. Daniel worked the land with the same patient stubbornness that had carried him through years alone. He rode the fence lines, checked the cattle, and repaired what needed repairing. Lena kept the cabin in order, gathered water from the pump, and mended what she could. She was a good hand with a needle, turning old feed sacks into aprons and worn shirts into something almost new. The baby's cries filled the spaces between them like the call of a bird that belongs to both sky and ground. It was Ari who bridged the distance. Daniel never reached for her without asking, but when Lena passed the baby into his arms, something in the air changed. He'd rock her slow, the way his father had once rocked him, boots planted firm on the cabin floor, eyes fixed on the fire. He rarely spoke, but when he did, it was to Ori, and always in the same low, steady voice, like he was telling her something worth remembering long after she'd grown. Lena began to share small pieces of herself in quiet moments. One evening, while Daniel patched a saddle by lamplight, she laid a bundle of dried plants on the table. She explained, in careful English, that her grandmother had taught her to find medicine in the hills, the long leaves for fever, the bitter root for pain, the tiny yellow flowers for calming the belly. Daniel listened, his hands pausing in their work. When she offered to brew a tea for his knee, he let her, though he didn't say so until morning that it had helped. It wasn't all words and remedies. Sometimes they worked side by side without speaking at all. She learned to ride dust fire in the evenings, her back straight, braid swaying against her shoulders as the mare circled the yard. At first, her grip on the reins was white-knuckled, but by the week's end, she was guiding the horse with a steady hand. Daniel didn't say it out loud, but the sight of her in the saddle reminded him of the way trust isn't built in grand gestures, but in the slow work of showing up, day after day. The carved hawk still sat on the mantel. She didn't carry it in her fist anymore, but he noticed she glanced toward it each night before bed. There was a story in that hawk, one she hadn't told him yet, but he wasn't the sort to pry. He knew from his own grief that some stories don't come out all at once. They arrive in pieces, and only when the holder is ready to let them go. One afternoon, while Daniel was hauling hay to the barn, he spotted something that made his shoulders tighten. Fresh hoof prints, not the round, worn marks of his own mare, but sharp-edged, recent. Whoever it was had come close enough to see the house. He said nothing to Lena, but his eyes scanned the horizon more often after that, and he started keeping the rifle within easier reach. There were lighter moments. 2. Lena taught him how to make a stew from dried corn and wild herbs, seasoning it with a pinch of something she wouldn't name. "Family secret," she said, the corner of her mouth almost curving into a smile. In return, he showed her how to mend leather straps and tie knots that would hold through the worst wind. Sometimes, when the baby was asleep, they would sit by the fire with their separate tasks, her sewing, him whittling, and let the silence be enough. Yet even in the quiet, there was something between them neither could name. It wasn't closeness, not yet, but it wasn't distance either, more like two people standing on opposite banks of the same river, knowing they'd have to cross someday but not yet sure how. Late one evening, as the sun burned itself down behind the hills, Lena stood in the doorway, watching him water the horses. She called out softly, "Why do you live alone out here?" Daniel didn't look up from the trough. "Some things are easier in the quiet," he said. She didn't press him, but she stayed there until he was done, the baby stirring once in her arms before settling again. He noticed other things in her, too, how she never turned her back when he walked by, how her eyes followed his hands when he worked, as if trying to measure what kind of man he was by what he built and what he mended, how she always kept Ori within arm's reach, even when she set her down in the cradle he'd repaired. For Daniel, the days had a new shape now. They began with the sound of Ori waking, and ended with the flicker of firelight on Lena's face as she rocked the baby to sleep. He couldn't have said what would come next, or how long they'd stay in this pattern, but he knew the rhythm suited him, and though he would never have admitted it out loud, he had started to think of the house not as his, but as theirs. Still, the land had its ways of reminding a man that peace was never promised. The hoof prints at the fence line lingered in his mind, a shadow stretching just beyond the reach of their firelight. Somewhere out there, someone might be looking for her. He didn't know who or why, but he knew enough about the world to recognize that people didn't always let go of what they thought was theirs. As the days shortened and the evenings cooled, Daniel found himself glancing more often toward the road that led in from the west. Sometimes it was just the wind stirring the dust. Sometimes it was nothing at all, but once in a while, he thought he caught the faint echo of hoofbeats carried in on the dusk air. And each time, it made him wonder just how long their quiet days could last. The wind had been restless all afternoon, tugging at the cottonwoods and sending dust skittering across the yard in little swirls that died as quickly as they were born. Daniel Hayes had the uneasy sense that the land was trying to tell him something. Years alone had taught him to read signs most men ignored. The horses were restless, shifting in their stalls. Dustfire kept tossing her head as if swatting at a fly that wasn't there. Somewhere far off, a low rumble rolled across the hills. Not thunder, not yet, but the kind of sound that sat heavy in a man's chest before a storm. Inside the house, Lena was rocking Ori near the fire, her shawl pulled close, eyes distant. The light was dim, that strange gray before rain. When the sky looks like it's holding its breath, Daniel had just stepped in from the barn, raincoat still dripping from an earlier squall, when he heard it. Hoofbeats, slow, heavy, deliberate, the kind that belonged to someone who wanted to be noticed. He moved to the door, lifting the latch just enough to see out. Through the curtain of drizzle, a tall rider emerged, a dark shape against the pale wash of the horizon. The man sat straight in the saddle, wearing a slick black duster that clung to his frame in the wet. His hat was pulled low, shadowing his face, but Daniel could see the jaw narrow, sharp in the posture of someone used to taking what he wanted. The rider stopped a few yards from the porch. He didn't dismount. Instead, he called out over the steady beat of the rain, his voice carrying that oily tone Daniel recognized from a lifetime of hearing men lie with a smile. "Evenin'. Stranger. Name's Cole Maddox. I'm looking for someone. Young woman. Dark hair. Carrying a babe. She goes by Lena." Daniel stepped out onto the porch, letting the rain soak his shoulders. "Don't know anyone by that name," he said evenly. Maddox shifted in the saddle, the leather creaking. "Funny thing, I seen tracks coming up this way, and I got papers saying she's mine. Her and that whelp." Daniel's gaze didn't leave the man's face. Papers don't mean a damn thing if they're written on a lie. There was a beat of silence. Maddox's horse pawed at the ground, anxious. Lightning flared behind him, throwing his shadow long against the wet earth. "I'll be back," Maddox said finally, his tone dropping low. With proof, he wheeled the horse around and rode off into the rain. Daniel stayed on the porch until the hoofbeats faded into the distance. Only then did he turn back toward the doorway. Lena was standing just inside. Ari clutched so tightly against her chest that the baby had started to fuss. Her face was pale, eyes wide with a fear that seemed older than the moment. "I brought him here," she whispered, as though speaking any louder would make it truer. "I cursed this place." Daniel crossed the room, his boots leaving small pools of water on the floorboards. He walked to the wall and reached up for the rifle that had hung untouched above the door for over a decade. The weight of it in his hands was both familiar and foreign. He checked the chamber, then leaned it against the hearth where it could be reached in an instant. "You stay as long as you want," he said. His voice didn't rise, but there was something in it that settled the air. For a long moment, they simply stood there, the rain tapping against the windows like impatient fingers. Lena loosened her grip on Ari just enough to press her cheek against the baby's head. Daniel saw her hand move to the pocket of her skirt, and then she pulled out the carved hawk. She stepped forward, holding it out to him. "For protection," she said softly. He looked down at the small wooden bird, the grain worn smooth by years of her touch. He closed her fingers back around it. "You keep it," he said. "You'll need it more." That night, the storm moved on, leaving the land washed clean but heavy with the scent of wet earth. Daniel sat in his rocker by the fire, the rifle within arm's reach, listening to the steady creak of the cradle as Lena rocked Ari. The quiet between them was not empty, it was a waiting kind of quiet, the kind that knows something is coming and chooses to be ready. Outside, the wind carried no more hoofbeats, but Daniel knew Maddox wasn't gone for good. Men like that didn't ride away and forget. They circled back, like wolves testing the fence line. And when that happened, Daniel intended to be standing where he was now between them and what they thought they could take. The carved hawk rested in Lena's lap as she sat across from him, eyes on the fire. Daniel wondered what the story was behind that bird, what hands had carved it, and why she gripped it like a lifeline. He didn't ask. Some answers were best given in their own time, but he made himself a quiet promise that night. Whatever storm Maddox was bringing with him, it would break here, on this land, before it touched the woman or the child. And for the first time in many years, Daniel felt the old steel settle in his bones, the kind that doesn't bend to papers or threats, the kind that holds its ground. The frost came early that morning, painting the fence posts white and leaving the air sharp enough to sting the lungs. Daniel Hayes had been out since first light, mending the corral gate, when he spotted dust rising on the western trail. It wasn't the slow, wandering dust of cattle. This was tighter, faster two riders coming in with purpose. He leaned on the gatepost, waiting. The wind carried the sound of hooves, steady and deliberate, until the shapes came clear against the pale winter sky. One was Cole Maddox, that same black duster draped over his frame like a shadow you couldn't shake. Beside him rode a man Daniel recognized from the settlement, a lawman named Sheriff Harlan, the silver star on his vest catching the weak morning sun. They reined up just short of the yard. Maddox grinned, but it wasn't a smile meant for peace. "Told you I'd be back," he said. "Brought the law with me this time." Harlan dismounted slow, his boots crunching in the frost. "Hayes," he began, "we've had a claim filed. Says you're harboring a runaway woman with ties to theft and other matters. Says she belongs to this man here." Daniel didn't move from where he stood, but something in his stance shifted, a solidness settling in his shoulders. "That's my wife you're talking about," he said evenly. "Lena Hayes. And that baby's mine." The words hung in the air like a gunshot. Even Maddox blinked, caught off guard. "Your wife," he spat. Daniel nodded once. "She came here fair and stayed by choice. Ain't no man's property, least of all yours." Harlan looked between them, his face unreadable. "If she says she's here of her own will, That's the end of the matter, far as I'm concerned. Daniel turned his head slightly toward the house. The door opened, and Lena stepped into the cold, Ari in her arms. She was wrapped in her shawl, her braid falling over her shoulder, and her eyes held steady on the men in the yard. "I'm staying," she said simply. Harlan gave a slow nod. "Then there's no bounty here." He adjusted his hat, stepping back toward his horse. Maddox's face twisted, but he said nothing more, only spat into the frost and swung into his saddle. The two men rode off, the sound of their hooves fading into the stillness. Inside the cabin, the air felt different. Not lighter, not yet, but shifted somehow, as if the walls themselves had heard Daniel's words and were holding them. Lena moved to the hearth. Laying Ori in the cradle Daniel had finished only the week before. He'd carved it from cedar boards left in the barn, smoothing each slat until his hands ached. Now it rocked gently as the baby cooed. "You didn't have to say that," Lena said quietly, her back to him. "I did," Daniel replied. It was true enough. She didn't answer, only pulled the shawl tighter around her shoulders. Daniel sat at the table, the fire throwing a warm light over his hands. For years, his life had been a narrow road, straight and quiet. Now, without his asking for it, that road had bent, and he found himself walking it without looking back. Days passed in a kind of uneasy calm. Maddox was gone, but the memory of his shadow lingered. Daniel kept the rifle close, not out of fear, but because some men came back in their own time, and it was best to be ready. Lena seemed quieter than before, though she tended to her tasks with the same steady care. At night, she sang to Ori in a low voice, the melody winding through the cabin like smoke, carrying words Daniel couldn't understand but didn't need to. One evening, as he sat by the fire, carving a small horse from a scrap of wood, a rider came up the path, a boy from the settlement, barely old enough to grow whiskers. He handed Daniel an envelope. The paper creased and damp from the cold. No return name, just the stamp from Santa Fe. Inside was a folded summons, the black ink sharp against the yellowed page. Daniel read it twice before setting it down. "They want me to testify," he said finally, his eyes still on the paper, before a territorial judge, harboring a fugitive, obstructing settler law. Lena stood by the table, her hands resting on the back of a chair. "I'll go with you. They want me, not you," he told her. "Then they'll see me with you," she said, her voice steady in a way that left no room for argument. He looked at her a long moment, then folded the summons and slipped it into his coat pocket. Outside, the cold pressed against the windows, the frost thickening in the corners. Inside, the fire popped and hissed, and somewhere in the cradle, Ori stirred, her small hand curling around the edge of the blanket. Daniel sat back in his chair, feeling the weight of what was coming. He'd stood his ground before, but this would be different. This would be standing in a room full of strangers who didn't care about rivers, or winters, or the way a man built his life one day at a time. They'd care about papers and claims, and the kind of law that could be bent by a man like Maddox. But he also knew this. He'd spoken the truth once, in his own yard, with the frost under his boots and the wind in his face. He could do it again, no matter where they made him stand. And if Maddox wanted to test what that truth was worth, then Maddox was going to learn what it meant when a man said mine and meant it not as ownership, but as a promise. Snow was falling in the kind of quiet that made the world feel smaller, as if the horizon had drawn in close to listen. The road to Santa Fe was a thin, pale ribbon ahead of them, and the wagon wheels groaned in protest at every rut. Daniel Hayes held the reins steady, the cold biting through his gloves. Beside him, Lena sat wrapped in her shawl, Ori bundled tight against her chest. She had not said much since they left the ranch, but her hand had stayed curled around the edge of his coat, an anchor against the winter air. The summons lay folded in his pocket, its words etched into his mind. Testify before a territorial judge, charges of harboring a fugitive and obstructing settler law. He had read it enough times to know the shape of every letter, but the meaning was simple. This was the day they would try to take her away. The town was busy in the way winter towns are, with people moving quickly between doors to escape the cold. But as the wagon rolled down the main street, eyes followed them. Some turned away as soon as they were met. Others whispered behind scarves and gloves. Daniel kept his gaze forward. He had been stared at before in his life, but this was different. This was the kind of watching that measured you, looking for cracks. The courthouse was a converted grain hall, its wide planks creaking underfoot. A potbelly stove glowed in the corner, though it did little to chase the chill. The judge was a thin man with tired eyes and a wool coat that had seen better years. Sheriff Harlan stood to one side, Maddox to the other, his black duster shedding flecks of melting snow. They called the lawman first. Harlan spoke without flourish, reciting the claim Maddox had filed. Maddox followed, his voice slick with the certainty of a man who thought the law was just another rope to pull tight around what he wanted. He spoke of papers, of property, of debts owed and rights taken. Not once did he look at Lena, only at the judge, as if the woman in question were a parcel of land rather than flesh and blood. Then it was Daniel's turn. He stepped forward, his boots ringing against the boards. His voice was steady, though the cold from outside still lived in his bones. "I found her by the river," he said. "She was bleeding. The baby had just been born. She had no horse, no coat, no food. She was going to die, and so was the child. I knew she was afraid. I knew she'd been mistreated, and I knew what a man becomes when he looks at a woman and sees something to own. She's not property. She's my wife." A murmur rippled through the benches. Daniel let the words hang in the air. He didn't try to dress them up. Truth didn't need dressing. The judge's gaze moved from Daniel to Lena. She stood straight, Ori resting quietly in her arms, her braid hanging down over one shoulder. Her eyes didn't waver. She said nothing, and she didn't need to. The baby's small hand reached up, catching a glint of light in the air, as if even she could feel the moment teetering toward decision. "There is no rightful claim of ownership on a person in this territory," the judge said at last, his voice cutting clean through the room. "Not by birth, not by marriage, not by coin, and there is no law that punishes a man for choosing decency." The gavel fell, a sharp report that seemed to loosen the cold itself. Case dismissed. They stepped out into the snow, the sky low and heavy. The wagon was dusted white by the time they reached it. Daniel helped Lena up, careful not to jostle Ori. They did not speak on the long ride home, but the silence was no longer edged with fear. It was warm now, like the space beside a fire when the night has settled in. When the ranch finally came into view, the sight of it felt different. The low hills seemed to fold around it a little tighter, the porch standing a little straighter against the wind. Inside, Daniel built a fire that roared to life, filling the cabin with the smell of cedar. Lena laid Ori in the cradle, humming a tune that had no words, only a kind of memory. Daniel fetched his carving knife, the one he hadn't touched since before Anna had died. He climbed the small ladder to the beam above the hearth. With steady strokes, he cut 2 new names into the wood, Lena and Ori. When he stepped down, he found her watching him, her braid now loose, a new thread woven through it, bright blue, the color of the Rio Grande in spring. They didn't speak of the trial or Maddox or the judge's ruling. Those things already belonged to the past. What remained was the choice they had made, and the knowledge that they had made it together. Daniel poured 2 mugs of coffee, setting one before her. This time, she took it. This time, he sat beside her, close enough for the heat of the mugs to meet between them. The snow kept falling outside, quiet and unhurried, as if the world had no reason to rush. Inside, the fire burned steady, the cradle creaked softly, and the names above the hearth caught the light in a way that made them seem older than they were, less like an addition, more like they had always been there, just waiting to be carved. Daniel Hayes's story begins with a cry in the fading light, a sound so sharp and desperate that it pulled him out of his routine and into the unknown. He was a man shaped by loss and solitude. a rancher on the outskirts of Santa Fe who had spent years keeping to himself after the death of his wife. Yet when he found Lena by the Rio Grande, barefoot, bloodied, and clutching a newborn, instinct overrode habit. Without demanding answers, without hesitation, he carried her home and set a fire between them and the cold. In the days that followed, Daniel and Lena built an unspoken rhythm. He tended the land, she tended the hearth. Their lives intertwined in small ways through shared work. Through the baby, Auri, who became their bridge, trust came slowly. Lena set down the carved wooden hawk she had clung to, and Daniel began letting the sound of her voice and the sight of her presence soften the edges of his solitude. But peace is never free from shadows. The first storm brought Cole Maddox, a man who claimed Lena and her child as his property. Standing on his porch in the rain, Daniel refused to yield, telling Maddox there was no one there by that name. That night, he took his rifle down from the wall for the first time in more than a decade, ready for whatever might follow. Maddox did return this time with Sheriff Harlan and a forged claim. In that moment, Daniel declared something he had never said before, that Lena was his wife and Auri his child. Lena, standing in the doorway, confirmed it. The lawman left, and Maddox rode off, but the conflict wasn't over. Soon after came the summons to Santa Fe, demanding Daniel testify before a territorial judge. Lena insisted on going with him. The hearing was a test of more than law. It was a test of courage. Maddox spoke of ownership, debts, and rights. Daniel spoke of a woman on the brink of death, a child barely alive, and the difference between possession and protection. She's not property, he told the judge. She's my wife. The ruling was clear. No person could be claimed as property in that territory, and no law punished a man for choosing decency. The ride home was silent but warm. At the ranch, Daniel carved Lena's and Auri's names into the beam above the hearth, placing them alongside the history of his home. Lena wove a new blue thread into her braid, a sign that she had chosen this life, just as Daniel had chosen her. The heart of their story is not just about a man protecting a woman from a dangerous pursuer. It is about the quiet courage of making room for someone in your life when you've long believed there is no room left. Daniel could have stayed silent that first night, turned away from the sound in the reeds. Lena could have fled again at the first sign of danger. Instead, they chose to stand together, to risk the trouble that comes with caring. The lesson here is timeless. Real strength often lies not in fighting every battle, but in choosing the ones that matter and standing firm in them. In our modern lives, the threats may not ride in on horseback, but the principles remain. We all face moments where we can step in for someone, speak up when it would be easier to stay silent, or extend trust when the world has given us reasons to withhold it. Applying this to our lives today means slowing down enough to notice the cries in the wind, the signs that someone near us is in need, even if they're not asking aloud. It means recognizing that the bonds we choose can be as profound as those we inherit, and that the decision to protect, help, or simply stand beside someone can ripple through their life in ways we may never see. Daniel's choice didn't just save Lena and Auri. It gave him a life he hadn't realized he was missing, and that's another truth worth carrying. Sometimes, in protecting someone else, we rescue parts of ourselves we thought were gone for good. If this story moved you, if you believe in the power of kindness, resilience, and standing for what's right, then I invite you to subscribe to this channel. Your support keeps these stories alive, fuels the work that goes into telling them, and ensures that we can continue to bring you more tales that stay with you long after they're told. Join us, and let's keep these voices, these choices, and these lessons alive for the next story yet to be told.